Hey, welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Legislative Update. I'm David Blackmon here with Jason Modglin, the president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. Jason, how's everything going this week?
It's really good. We're actually catching some rain here in Austin, so very positive about that. And yeah, everything's going well in Austin.
Yeah, we've had it up here too. It's been nice. Listen, I know you were out in Washington for a couple of days this past week working on some legislation, having a bunch of visits over in Congress. Talk about how that went.
It went really well. We had some very positive visits with House members and some key Senate staff. HR1 being the big ticket item in the House, the comprehensive package made up of nearly 20 bills from the three committees of jurisdiction: natural resources, energy and commerce, and in transportation and infrastructure. And so those kind of three key committees coming together to put forward this very big package on domestic energy production. Not just oil and gas, also renewables and mining and things of that nature, but some key provisions for oil and gas that we were very excited to see. Permitting reform to some extent, the NEPA efforts there. They also had some key federal lands requirements to make sure that those leases are being executed in a timely manner, and that permits come through in a timely manner. Just this week, hearing new numbers, the average permit delay in New Mexico is 274 days. Compare that with Texas, where you can get a permit in 2 to 3 days. And what is a permit? Our oil and gas folks know what that is, but some of your listeners might not know. You're basically guaranteeing that you have the right to be there and that you have the wherewithal to drill that well. That's it. It's not an extensive environmental review or some other mechanism that needs to be exercised or put in place. You're vowing that you have a valid lease to be there, and certainly the federal government knows that when you've executed a federal lease with them, and then that you have the ability in a timely manner to get a rig out there and to spud a well. And so those are kind of the two checks. Texas is able to do it miraculously in 48 hours. In the federal government, it takes 9 months. So great visits up there. Some of the Texas delegation that met with us, Tony Gonzalez, Jake Elzey, Henry Cuellar, but then also had very positive visits with lots of staff in the Texas delegation. And then we made our way over to the Senate side and had good meetings with Senator Manchin's staff, Senator Capito's staff, and Senator Barrasso's staff. So very positive meetings over there. Part of the concern that we have is on the methane tax, and August Pfluger, congressman out of the Midland area, has a repealer in HR1. It's HR 1411, which would repeal the Inflation Reduction Act methane tax. Very supportive of that. Senator Schumer on the Senate side has already announced it's kind of dead on arrival, and so then the pivot is, if not repeal, then what? And there's not a lot of appetite in both chambers for modification to the tax, either to ensure that the exemptions are put into law, or that there's a delay in implementation because we're waiting on methane rules. Methane rules are likely not going to be finalized in the states by 2024, which is when the tax kicks in 2024. And so, it's reasonable to ask that that tax be after methane rules are adopted. But there's not a lot of appetite for that in both the House and Senate. And so we're starting to shift in our conversations, particularly with Democratic congressmen and senators, and to help us comply with the tax. And then obviously what every individual and business wants to do, which is tax avoidance. So this is designed for, as your emissions drops, your tax bill should drop. So let's write it that way, as opposed to what we've started to see, which is, this is really complicated. Let's just add up your miles of pipe and tax you for miles of pipe. That doesn't solve anything. That's a production tax, essentially. A BTU tax, as you know, thankfully Congress has roundly rejected several times. And so it's going to require Congress to be invested in the process, to really be looking over EPA's shoulder and making sure that they're adhering to the intent, which was, as we continue to drive down emissions, which has been the case over the last decade and even longer, that tax should be reduced over time. And so, you know, you're kind of wearing two hats. You go into a Republican office and repeal, and it's a welcome message there. And then you step into a Democratic office and saying, help us continue to reduce emissions by writing this effectively so that our tax goes down when we invest in vapor recovery units, when we invest in monitoring, when we invest in other types of technologies that do reduce emissions. So good visit up there in DC. And I would say the best part, apart from the kind of good conversations on HR1 and the IRA, is that it's back open. The COVID and January 6th made Congress a nightmare getting in and out. You had to stand outside of buildings, wait for an escort. You had a very strict amount of time that you could be in the building, and then you had to exit. You had to wear your mask everywhere. You know, it made it very cumbersome to exercise your First Amendment right to go talk to your government and petition them. And so it's back open. That was fantastic to see. There were school groups there. There were the Alzheimer's Association was there in force. It was phenomenal to see just a return to normalcy up there. So it was very positive about that.
Well, let's hope that can last. You never know what's going to come around the corner next.
That's right.
So let's go to Texas here. You know, a lot of stuff going on in the legislature this week. I guess the first thing on my list is in the House, House Bill 1500, the Sunset Bill on the PUC came up this week, and it looks like it's going to move. What are the main provisions in that Sunset Bill for the PUC?
Yeah, several items to really dig into kind of their water rate making, and that's been a key function that was moved from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality over to the Public Utility Commission a number of years ago. But not to disparage any staff over there, because they do a phenomenal job, but they had not asked for the resources in order to really do their job effectively on water rate making. They're doing that now as they should. They need the staff to be able to take complaints, to be able to go investigate some of these water utilities if they jack up their water prices too high, or they don't tie it to use or things of that nature. And so you've got really good leadership there now at the Public Utility Commission, phenomenal executive director, but then also some very good commissioners that were appointed by Governor Abbott to really dig in and make sure they've got the tools and the staff necessary to get the job done. I think another part of the Sunset Bill, which is was a key recommendation of the Railroad Commission several years ago, is this public facing or public office designed to just educate constituents on what the office does. We've had that Power to Choose website for a number of years in the public. Excuse me, the open market for electricity. Those of us in co-ops or in municipal owned utilities don't get the power to choose, but everybody else across the state can regularly shop for your power. But that's been kind of the limited function of the outward facing nature of the Public Utility Commission. And so they're really undertaking kind of a more comprehensive process to make sure that voters are in tune with what's going on in the power market, in the phone realm, and then also in your water. Those are kind of the three utilities that the Public Utility Commission oversees.
Well, it's been a good change in this century that we've seen. When I first started doing government affairs work in Austin, the industries being regulated, we're always lobbying for very minimal funding of these regulatory agencies. And that has now evolved into a situation where the regulated industries have become the advocates for beefed up funding, not just to the PUC, but also the Railroad Commission, the TCEQ, to make sure that these regulatory agencies have the funding they need to effectively police and regulate what's happening in the industry. And it's been a really smart and welcome change, I think, here in Texas.
Yeah, I agree 100%. If you're sitting waiting for a permit, you're sitting and waiting for an inspector, and they don't have the ability to process that or get it out to you.
Yeah.
That the pace of business is then hampered and hindered pretty substantially. And so, yes, that's certainly been the effort of our association and others, is to try to make sure that our regulators have the key tools and the funding they need to do their job.
Yeah, and the improved communication has been really important as well. We don't hear a lot of hue and cry over people wanting to rename the Texas Railroad Commission, for example, that we saw 15, 20 years ago, really as recently as 5 years ago. And it's because more and more people understand that's what the Railroad Commission does. Doesn't have anything to do with railroads anymore, but it regulates energy. And, and that's largely because of all the improved communication. So it's all been a really positive change for the state. Let's go on to property tax reduction. The Senate unanimously voted out a $16.5 billion property tax reduction bill this week. What's in that?
Yeah, really phenomenal effort by Senator Betancourt and others. Actually, a new senator up there in Tan Parker had a portion of that. So what it would do is it would raise your homestead exemption from $40,000 to $70,000. So the first $70,000 of appraised value on your home would be tax exempt, which is phenomenal. Saves a considerable amount of money for homeowners across the state. There's also a portion of rate compression on the school taxes, and so that would save a little bit more money. There's also a component for businesses. So your inventory tax would be compressed a little bit, as well as the exemption for tangible personal property would be raised a little bit. Not quite the 100,000 that was the targeted amount, but a substantial amount to help small businesses like the Alliance with kind of our desk and chairs and bookshelves. Where it's truly a nuisance tax. We'll get a note from the city of Austin, every 3 or 4 years saying pony up, or we're taking your chairs type deal. So, it'll be nice to kind of get away from that. It is a little bit of money for local governments, but it's mainly just a nuisance tax. And so that'll be nice to kind of get away from and phase out. We'll see kind of what the reception is in the House. The House has had similar kind of bipartisan support for lowering the appraisal cap in the House and tying that to all property. So this past week, the House Ways and Means Committee moved forward an appraisal cap bill that lowers your homestead appraisal cap from 10%, where it's currently at, lowers it to 5%. And then applies that to all property. We've talked about that in the past, where the lightning rod for most people is their appraisal. That's what they see on a regular basis, going up constantly. There's less focus on the tax bill, which seems counterintuitive, because that's ultimately where you're writing the check and the money's going out the door. But the appraisal is what catches people's eye. And so, and just, the sheer kind of unfairness of that. I bought this house for $100,000. Now it's worth $200,000. I haven't realized any change. I'm still living in the house, and yet I'm paying double the tax bill. And so that's a frustration for both homeowners and businesses across the state. The House has said, let's focus there rather than continuing to kind of tweak on the margins. I think the Senate bill is actually more impactful on your bottom line. Right. It'll save you more money, but it's counterintuitive. That's probably the less politically palatable legislation. Certainly dropping the appraisal cap is going to have lots of people very excited. They might not save as much money, but that would be kind of the big win. So it'll be interesting to see between the House and the Senate how they kind of reconcile those two efforts. The Senate with kind of the big home run in the short term for saving you a lot of money. The House potentially with the long-term savings for folks. And what's the two? How do they resolve those two issues?
Yeah, and that is the bifurcation there. You have a short-term bigger impact. Neither one's a big impact. There's so many people in the state that you talk about 16.5 billion in property tax reduction. For the average home, it's probably less than $100, but
it goes quick.
And it goes quick. Yeah. But in the long term, dropping that appraisal cap, over the long term would definitely save more money for the average person. And I'm guessing we're probably not expecting unanimous agreement in the House over anything, because I can't remember the last time that happened, frankly, on a significant piece of legislation. So, but anyway, hopefully something will get done in this session. Property tax relief is definitely needed. Let's go to water. Water is another big issue, and it has been in this state for a long time and will always be. We've got Senate Bill 28 that's going to approve an updated Texas Water Fund that was established, I think, in, was it 2013 when we got that done?
2013 was the SWIFT fund. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that allocates a portion of the rainy day fund funded by Texas severance taxes on the oil and gas industry to fund a water plan. And this one would update that. What exactly, would it update? What are the differences they're trying to put in place?
Well, going back to 2013, just very briefly, that effort called the SWIFT Fund, the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas. We've had water plans in this state going back 70 years. Yeah. But it's kind of like, if I ever win the lottery, this is what I would spend my money on. It didn't really mean much of anything until the early 2000s, when we started having local governments, river authorities, water control districts, things of that nature, that could have taxing authority and start putting money towards their water plan. Come 2013, after just a devastating drought, in 2011 and a budget surplus thanks to oil and gas. Money was put forward for the State Water Implementation Fund, which basically said, as you're doing projects, you're doing your calculation to take care of the existing ratepayers. But we know for a fact that the state is going to grow. Your water district is going to grow over that time. And so the state will back the portion of growth. And it was a phenomenal effort, which did really good things, is doing really good things for the fast growing areas of the state. And when I say fast, I mean very fast, 20-25% growth. Rural parts of the state are growing as well, just not as fast.
Right.
And so they really haven't been able to benefit despite the assurances from the legislature and the carve outs in the 2013 fund for rural projects. They really haven't occurred to the degree that we had hoped for. And so Senator Perry out of the Lubbock area, and then Tracy King out of the Uvalde area has said, one, we represent rural areas of the state, and we want to make sure that they get a portion of this. But two, the way that we structured the 2013 effort really doesn't help those local entities, those rural counties that may only be growing by 3, 4, 5% a year. That additional adder from the state really isn't enough to build big projects and potentially attract new investment into rural Texas. And so Senator Perry has really championed this Water for Texas effort, which looks at rural areas of the state, but then also ask a fundamental question of where are we going to get new water from? And that's been something that's been kicked around and hypothesized for a long period of time. Even before the 1950s, you had speculators on we're going to build pipelines to the Mississippi, and because it floods on a pretty regular basis, and why can't we capture some of that water and move it west? And so we might not go as far as the Mississippi, but there are certainly water districts to the north of us and to the east of us that regularly have additional water surpluses that they would love to be able to sell or move into river basins located in Texas. And so this is an opportunity to look to those types of projects. He also has been very smart about thinking about produced water and are there opportunities there. And so we've talked about the Texas Produced Water Consortium. This has a component to say if produced water is ever identified as a potential new water source, that there could be some additional funding in place for some industrial applications or conservation applications. And then also it's heavy on desal and really trying to get smart about we're doing desal in various locations, El Paso being kind of the longest and best desal project in the state. But we're starting to see some good desal projects along our Gulf Coast. But they're fairly limited in those locations. How can we get some of that water farther inland? And so it's a great effort by Senator Perry. The kind of water groups have assembled a very large coalition, and they've started to add kind of business-oriented associations onto their list. And so we've joined. I think the Texas Oil and Gas Association has joined. Maybe some of the other type of folks like the Chemical Council and builders and things of that nature have started throwing our support in as well for doing something big on water. They have a lot of money this session. As we just mentioned, they're allocating 16, 17, 18 billion dollars towards property tax relief. But can they set aside some portion of that for big infrastructure projects? And water is always going to be a key issue in Texas because we live in a desert. We live on a body of water that is largely salt, being the Gulf of Mexico. And there's no natural lakes. There's one natural lake in the
Right.
state. Everything else has been reservoirs and kind of big public works projects.
Yeah.
So we're naturally a dry state, and we need to think smart about water.
We do, and you know, it's funny you mentioned the concept of building pipelines to move water from other parts of the country into Texas. Lyndon Johnson, when he was in the House in the 1930s, working on, you know, all the federal public works projects with the Roosevelt administration, actually brought that up and had bills that would have done that. You know, along with all the hydroelectric dams he was helping to fund here in Texas. And the bill never got passed, unfortunately, or maybe it's fortunate, I don't know. But it's a concept that goes a long way back in history. And Senator Perry, I'm glad he's taken that up again. You know, you never know. There may be a good way to get that done, and there certainly is opportunity from other river basins. Okay, let's see. Let's talk about carbon capture now. We got, I mean, all these big issues percolating in the legislature. Senator Nichols, Robert Nichols, and Representative Dennis Bonnen both have.
The other one, Greg Bonnen.
I'm sorry. Golly, wrong Bonnen. I apologize. I apologize.
Well, you got brothers in the legislature for a long time. Dennis is not there anymore, but Greg is.
Yeah, Dennis, a former speaker, of course. But anyway, so they're moving bills that would promote and enable carbon capture projects here in Texas, which is a huge economic opportunity and natural resource opportunity for the state. Talk about the progress that was made there this week.
Yeah, so two very big pieces of legislation by Robert Nichols and Greg Bonnen to really capture a portion of that $1 trillion industry that is certainly coming globally. We've been doing carbon capture in the state for a long time as it relates to enhanced oil recovery, putting CO2 downhole, pressuring up that zone, and then reaping the benefit of added production off of that. But this is a little different. This is more in the sequestration category of finding ways to store CO2 underground for long periods of time, removing it either from the atmosphere or the tailpipe so that you can lower the overall emissions of that product or of that industry or of that particular area of the state. So we've joined with a fairly broad coalition. And I think really while oil and gas has the expertise in this area, this is not primarily for the oil and gas industry. This is for businesses. This is for commercial entities like manufacturers. This is for transportation networks that are finding the need to reduce their overall emissions and need someplace to put that carbon dioxide that is not up into the atmosphere. And so the Greater Houston Partnership, Texas Association of Business, Texas Association of Manufacturers, those types of entities, along with many of the oil and gas trade associations in the state, are backing these efforts on carbon storage. And so this would be carbon transferred by a pipeline and then ultimately cleaned up and put down whole and sequestered there. There's implications for how do you allocate payment, and so figuring out what the role of the surface owner is in that, whose reservoir are you pumping into, essentially, and what the Texas Supreme Court has said, and there's been some federal legislation on this, is that the negative space, the empty space, is the domain of the surface owner. And so it's a little bit different when we're talking about mineral owners. We're talking about oil and natural gas and other types of minerals that are below the surface. And that is a property right in and of itself. But the negative space, the empty space, is the domain of the surface owner. And so figuring out ways to appropriately compensate them for the use of that space, finding ways to set up the regulatory controls. The Railroad Commission of Texas, which hopefully will have primacy over this area of industrial activity, doesn't have the setup yet to create units of CO2 storage. They can create a unit as it relates to hydrocarbon production, but don't have anything as it relates to kind of a surface unit use. They do have the ability to restrict the surface from accessing the ground. They've long had that in terms of gas storage, and then ultimately kind of a long-term, what does this look like 50, 75, 100 years down the road? And so Senator Nichols and Chairman Bonnen have been thoughtful in that process to determine what this looks like long after either some of these manufacturers have gone away, or what it would look like for the state. So a very big piece of legislation.
Yeah.
I know they've got their work cut out for them, and so they're working with a lot of different folks to try to get it accomplished.
Well, it's a big deal, and like you said, it's a huge thing for the state, and it's really good to see so much thought and effort going into all of these various big ticket items in this session. I can't really remember a session. We're not even talking about all the general societal stuff that's happening, voucher bills and things like that. We're just talking about stuff that would impact energy, and yeah, man, this busiest session I can really ever even think of, frankly. It's fairly amazing, all the stuff that's happening here. We're halfway through the session now. This today, as we record this on Friday, I think is the 70th day of the 140-day session. And frankly, the action's just really getting started. Next week, they're going to start taking up bills on the floor, aren't they, in the House?
That's right. Yeah, if you have visited the House in this first 70 days, you might be scratching your head as to what they're doing. This week, they honored Robert Earl Keene, certainly a Texas treasure, right. But it doesn't quite make too much sense. You got time, let's get to work. And so next week is what they're exactly doing, is starting up. They've got a handful of bills each day on Tuesday and Wednesday that they'll take up and move over to the Senate. And then I would imagine the Senate will start to get to work on those bills. The Senate has been very hard at work, as we've talked about before. Lieutenant Governor sets his priority list and moves very quickly to have those committees move that legislation, get it to the floor, and get it over to the House. And so the Senate's already had a few long nights, so some late nights over there in the chamber with the green carpet, and now it's the House's turn to really get up and moving, and they'll have a light week next week, and then that following week will be pretty heavy. They're supposed to have the House budget up on the floor the first week of April, Easter week, and so they'll have at least one long night there, kind of working through the budget, trying to figure out how do you spend these billions of dollars on various aspects of state government over the next 2-year period. So look for that, probably either a late night on the 5th or the 6th, that first week of April, to be happening in the House.
Well, for anybody who thinks these folks in the Capitol don't work hard, I would urge you to go to Austin and walk into the Capitol building during the last month of the session at 7 o'clock any night of the week. And you'll be amazed at all the activity that's happening, and even up until midnight and even the wee hours of the morning.
Yeah,
they do work hard.
come on a Saturday or a Sunday, and
Yeah,
yeah,
even the weekends. Yeah.
you'll see us there, kind of waiting for committee reports to get out, and then stuff on the floor happening quite a bit, and so it is. Well, it's a nice contrast to go from DC this week and see kind of activity there.
Yeah.
Very happy to be back in Texas.
I always was too.
And this process, it's far more enjoyable, at least from my perspective, and so. But it's nice to see the two differences.
Well, Jason, I can't tell you how much I appreciate being able to do these with you. You're an incredible wealth of information. And let's do it again next Friday.
Yeah, let's talk next week.
All right, we'll do it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next week.